Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Welcome to another Managing the Atom seminar. I'm Marty Now. I'm the Executive Director of the project on Managing the Atom. And our speaker today is Ambassador Stephen Pifer. Ambassador Pifer was the Senior Director on the National Security Council, responsible for Russia and Ukraine and Eurasia during the Clinton years, and then he was ambassador to the Ukraine. He was also responsible within the State Department for Russia and Eurasian affairs after being ambassador, and now he's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he's recently written this book with Michael O'Hanlon, The Opportunity, Next Steps in Reducing Nuclear Arms, which I highly recommend. It's a great just a good summary of all of the issues that are on the agenda after the Prague speech and where we might be able to go with them. So, Steve, please.
Yeah, Marty, well, first of all, thanks very much for having this. Let me talk a little bit. I'll draw some ideas on the opportunity, but talk a little bit about where I think Washington is on some questions such as next steps in nuclear reductions, what to do about missile defense, and a couple of other arms control issues. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I think this administration faces in achieving what it would like to do. I mean, first, just to start off with where things are now, is the New START treaty was signed about 3 years ago. It's now in its third year of implementation, having entered into force in February of 2011. And these are the three main limits in the treaty. 1,550 deployed strategic warheads, 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles, and I think those are the two more meaningful limits. I should note that 1,550 is arms control math, and that 1,550 actually probably equals about 1,800 on the American side. And that's because that 1,550 limit counts the actual number of warheads on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. But since neither the American nor the Russian militaries keep weapons on bombers, the negotiators decided to attribute each bomber with one weapon. And the Federation of American Scientists estimates there are about 300 cruise missiles and bombs for U.S. strategic nuclear bombers. So in this case, 1,550 on the American side is probably more like about 1,800. Now, this is certainly, I think, a significant step forward on the START 1 treaty, which allowed each side 6,000 weapons using slightly different counting rules. But I think there's still a question to be asked whether 20 years after the end of the Cold War and 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether these sorts of numbers are still necessary. The other thing, too, is that New START covers just deployed strategic forces. So these limits cover about 35% of the total nuclear U.S. stockpile now. They don't count reserve strategic weapons. And it's estimated that the United States military now maintains at least one strategic weapon in reserve for every deployed strategic warhead. Part of that is a hedge against geopolitical surprise. Part of that is also a hedge against a nasty technical failure. Waking up one day and finding some warheads don't work, they have weapons that they can switch out to replace them. And, of course, arms control does not yet cover non-strategic nuclear weapons, also referred to as tactical or sub-strategic. When I use the term non-strategic, it means everything that's not limited by a New START. Now, President Obama made clear when he was signing the New START treaty back in April of 2010 that he would like to go further. And he talked about a next step that would involve limits on not only non-strategic nuclear weapons, but also on reserve strategic weapons. He has, of course, goes back to the Prague vision. I think people focus more on the idea of world without nuclear weapons. I think it's important to remember that he attached a lot of qualifiers to that. But he also said things like reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons in U.S. policy, and that was reflected in the Nuclear Posture Review in 2010, which said things such as the fundamental purpose of American nuclear weapons is to deter a nuclear attack, and a goal should be to create the conditions in which the sole purpose of nuclear weapons would be to deter a nuclear attack on the United States, its allies, and its forces. Over the last year and a half now, the administration has been conducting the Nuclear Posture Review implementation study, which we will never see. It's basically the document in which the president articulates his guidance as to what he wants to do with nuclear weapons if he ever has to use them. And that guidance is then taken by the Defense Department and ultimately by Strategic Command, and it's translated then into the requirements that they have for X number of nuclear weapons. The study was launched in the fall of 2011. The surmise outside of the government is around May or June of last year. The White House decided to put it on hold, that they did not want to have it come to conclusion before the election. It's still, at least as far as we can tell, it is basically completed, but the president has not yet checked the box. There are a number of questions it's going to ask in terms of weapons numbers. There are a number of questions that some groups that were talking to the administration about the study were suggesting, such as zero-based targeting, rather than taking the existing targeting set and working back from there, actually starting with a clean board and saying, if you wanted to create a deterrent, how many weapons would you really need? Another question that some of us raised was, does the United States still need to maintain a requirement for prompt launch? The idea being, and this translates most directly into a requirement for the Air Force to be able to launch the Minuteman Force in about 20 minutes' time. My judgment would be is that the president would like to have more than 20 minutes if he had to make that kind of a call. He would like to have hours or even days. And one of the suggestions that was made was that, given the fact that the Air Force has decided to deploy only single warheads on the Minuteman ICBMs, the risks of making the wrong call here are less, because at best, if there were a surprise attack, and you could only be talking about the Russians would have to expend at least one warhead to destroy one warhead, and most think the Russians, being conservative, would use two, so they would exhaust half of their force to destroy about a quarter of the U.S. force. If that prompt launch requirement goes away, it also may have an impact on the number of ballistic missile submarines that the United States needs, because right now the factor that they focus on is the number of submarines on station that can launch immediately. If in fact you drop the prompt launch requirement and you said, well, we may give ourselves days to make that decision, then the more important criteria would be the number of submarines that would be safely and securely at sea. So those are some of the questions that we assume may be thought about this process. The question is when the president actually checks the box. And I think looking forward in the arms control world, there are a couple questions to ask her. Is your next step just addressing deployed strategic weapons, the type of weapons that are limited to New START, or do you go further and include all? This chart here is from the Federation of American Scientists, and I put a little asterisk there when it talks about deployed strategic in that top row. That's not using New START counting rules. That's using the Federation of American Scientists' estimate as to actually how many warheads are on American ICBMs and SLBMs, and how many bombs and cruise missiles are at Whiteman Air Force Base and Minot Air Force Base for use by B-2s and B-52s. And then the rest of them on the Russian side. And then what you see non-strategic is an area where the Russians have at least a 4-to-1 advantage. Some estimates put the Russian advantage at more like 6 to 8-to-1. There's not a lot of transparency in this area. And then on non-deployed reserve strategic warheads, that's an area where the United States is believed to have a fairly significant numerical advantage. And when you take those first 3 rows, that's what we would consider the stockpile. In fact, the U.S. and Russian stockpiles by these numbers are relatively equal. And then you have one more set, which are weapons that are retired and are in the queue awaiting dismantlement. And part of the problem here is it just, there's been something of a backlog. I think the estimate now is perhaps 6 to 8 years to get rid of the weapons that are now in the American backlog. So that sort of describes what the total U.S. force looks like. The question now, I think, is it time to bring in non-strategic and reserve strategic weapons? Certainly, I think there's sentiment on the part of American allies for doing so. If you go back to the Senate ratification debate for New START, the Senate articulated in its resolution of ratification desire that the administration seek to reduce non-strategic weapons. And I think there's an additional reason why the United States and NATO may want to think about this. In May of last year, you had the Deterrence and Defense Posture Review that was approved by NATO at the Chicago Summit, which basically endorsed current NATO nuclear posture and said that changes in that posture would require some reciprocal step undefined by the Russians. And I think NATO can get through the next 4 or 5 years with its current posture intact. But if I look at 8 to 10 years, I think that posture comes under a lot of strain. And it comes under strain because the German Air Force is basically now replacing its Tornado aircraft, which is its dual-capable delivery system for American weapons that might be provided under programs of cooperation. And they're replacing it with the Eurofighter, which is not dual-capable. And the expectation in Germany is that once the Tornadoes are retired, that was originally supposed to be around 2018. I think the German Air Force has pushed that back to about 2020. But once that happens, the expectation is Germany is that the American nuclear weapons go home. That in turn, I think, would create fairly significant political pressures in both the Netherlands and Belgium for those countries to follow suit, which would then, I think, leave Turkey and Italy, the last two countries reportedly to host American nuclear weapons, under quite a bit of political pressure. So my concern here is that NATO is currently on a course by which the nuclear posture will change in a very significant way over the next 10 years, as the result primarily of unilateral national decisions, for which the alliance will achieve nothing in terms of reductions on the Russian side. That seems to me, though, an additional reason to start talking about weapons in Europe and trying to get some kind of arrangement on non-strategic. And then finally, if the United States does succeed in getting the Russians to talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons, we will be having to talk also about reserve strategic weapons. And in fact, President Obama has already said he's prepared to do that. So a couple comments on what options there might be. When Mike O'Hanlon and I wrote this book, or finished it last summer, what we talked about was there's room for one more bilateral U.S.-Russia deal. And that's because the United States and Russia, with arsenals up around 4,500 to 5,000 weapons, are significantly above everybody else. The next largest third weapon state is believed to be France, with about 300 weapons. So there's room for one more U.S.-Russia negotiation, at least before you get into the complexities of bringing third countries into it. And what we argued for was it's now time to bring in all nuclear weapons, deployed strategic, non-deployed strategic, and all non-strategic. Basically everything except those weapons that are in the dismantlement queue. And you would have some of the regime to deal with them. And what you do here, we suggested a total number of 2,000 to 2,500 total weapons for each side. And what happens, and I'll show this in the chart in a moment, is that aggregate limit becomes the mechanism to force a trade-off. If I go back to this chart here, the Russians have a significant advantage in non-strategic. The Americans have a significant advantage in non-deployed or reserve strategic. The aggregate limit basically forces them each to reduce those limits, those advantages, and come down. Now, within this, we would argue that there should be a subceiling of 1,000 deployed strategic warheads. So that would take the 1550 limit in New START, bring it down by about 35%. And that focuses because those still, I think, remain for both sides the weapons of greatest concern. But this here shows how the notional reduction would work. You have the U.S. now, the U.S. after, Russia now, Russia after in terms of those four columns. The dark blue is deployed strategic weapons, the reddish-brown is non-strategic weapons, and the light green is reserve strategic. And basically, if you had an aggregate limit of 2,000, what happens is that drives the Russians to reduce their advantage in non-strategic weapons. They would still have an advantage, but it would be significantly less than today, in return for which the United States would have to reduce its advantage in reserve strategic. Again, at the end of the day, it would probably have more reserve strategic weapons than the Russians, but that would be a matter of choice, and the advantage would be significantly less than it is today. So that aggregate limit becomes the mechanism to force the trade-off between the two areas in which the sides have an advantage. This would result in about a 50% reduction in the side stockpiles, but it still would leave the United States and Russia each with about 6 to 7 times as many nuclear weapons as the next largest country. And there were press reports saying that the administration, in terms of its thinking, these reports came out about a month ago, is thinking about 1,000 to 1,100 as the level for deployed strategic weapons. And then there was one report saying that they were thinking in terms of 2,500 to 3,500 as an aggregate limit. I'm not quite certain why you would need 3,500 weapons on that, but that was one report, and the rationale behind that was not spelled out. Now, I think the Russians are already significantly below the limit of 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles. So as much as the U.S. military, I think, would prefer to maintain more missiles and bombers just for the flexibility, you're going to have to bring the number down. And what we argued was you could come down to about 500. We would not seek to limit delivery systems for non-strategic nuclear weapons, simply because when you're talking about F-16s, F-35s, and their Russian counterparts, you're talking about aircraft that have primarily conventional missions, and neither military, I think, is going to want to get into that. But the question would then become, what could you do with the triad? The Russians are already below 500 deployed strategic delivery vehicles, and by some estimates are headed down to about 400, so 500 would not be a problem for them. And I just put up a couple of options there that looking at the U.S. force, and I think there's a military rationale and still a political desire to maintain the triad. at 500 deployed strategic delivery vehicles, you still are able to maintain, I think, very robust options for your triad. The one other thing that comes in here, and it's be a combination more, really driven more by the warhead limit, is the Russians have been talking now about, for about a year to 2 years, about building a new heavy intercontinental ballistic missile that would be a replacement for the SS-18 and SS-19. And the last SS-18s and SS-19s probably need to be retired in the next 5 to 7 years. They're already past their shelf date. If the limit came down to 1,000 deployed strategic warheads, that might be low enough to get the Russians to abandon that missile, which even a number of Russian analysts are saying is a really bad idea. First, it would continue American concern about a threat to Minuteman ICBMs in their silos, but it would also result in the Russians having large numbers of warheads on a relatively small number of targets, which it doesn't seem to make sense in terms of crisis stability. But we'll have to see how they play that. Now, getting to this negotiation, this big treaty, is not going to be easy. It took 11 months to do the New START treaty. That was a land speed record. I think Rose Gadamuller and Anatoly Antonov deserve a lot of credit for getting that done and that quickly. But this treaty here, you're talking about probably 2 to 3 years at least, and with a bit of luck. So one question might come up is, could you do things, for example, like accelerate implementation of the New START limits? The New START limits not fully kick in until 2018. There are probably some scheduling issues and some operational issues why accelerating the limit on 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles would be hard on the American side. The Russians actually have already met it. But one idea that we pushed, and when I talk to people in the administration, it seems to get a bit of a positive resonance, is could you accelerate implementation of the 1550 limit? And even if you can't take missiles out of tubes or off of submarines that quickly, just take the warheads off. Now, it would be unusual to have a deployed ICBM with 0 warheads on it, but it is not prohibited by the treaty, and the treaty has mechanisms that would allow the Russians to inspect. So, for example, if a Russian inspection team went out to France's Warren Air Force Base and was told, here are 30 deployed ICBMs with no warheads on board, they could choose to exercise their right to go and check one of those and confirm there were in fact 0 warheads. So that might be one thing. With regards to non-strategic and reserve strategic, there's a lot of room for transparency. One idea that's been discussed in NATO channels is that the United States does not maintain any non-strategic weapons on its aircraft. And right now the United States has only B-61 bombs. That's the only non-strategic weapon in the inventory, with the retirement of the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile warhead. And it's believed that most, if not all, Russian weapons also are separated or demated from their delivery systems. So one idea that has been talked about within NATO is, could you have the United States and Russia take as a political policy that they would continue not to maintain non-strategic nuclear weapons on board delivery systems, and then perhaps do some exhibitions, not a verification regime, but some exhibitions to show how that happens. The question of doing a big treaty like we talked about, 2 to 3 years, so it does raise a question, what if the administration wants to do something more quickly? And a quicker deal might look like the following. You might just take your deployed strategic forces, and the simplest way would be to take the 3 limits, the 1550 limit, the 700 limit, the 800 limit, and negotiate a treaty amendment that just lowered those numbers. So you could bring 1550 down to 1,000, 700 down to 500, 800 down to, say, 600. And you could still use all the definitions, all the verification provisions, pretty much as is in the treaty. But I think there would be questions about that. I think the Senate would question that. The Senate has been on record of saying the next agreement ought to address more than just deployed strategic. I think you'd have questions from the allies. And there also may be some leverage that the United States could get in terms of offering reductions of deployed strategic forces that might be useful in getting the Russians to address their non-strategic weapons. So the question then comes up is, could you do something on non-strategic nuclear weapons? One idea that some Russians have put across in a Track 2 dialogue that we're working on at Brookings is maybe you do a phased approach where you go ahead and you negotiate the quick deal on deployed strategic weapons, but then you have 2 or 3 phases to approach non-strategic weapons, starting out with transparency, some confidence-building measures, greater transparency, and in the final stage, entering into a negotiation. that might be possible, but I think there would have to be a pretty clear signal and a commitment at the beginning that that process, A, does not go on forever, and ultimately ends up in a negotiation that would produce limits on non-strategic weapons and presumably also on reserve strategic, comparable to limits on deployed strategic weapons. Now, one thing that's been discussed in NATO also is the possibility of confidence-building measures, such as relocation of weapons, consolidation of weapons at a fewer number of sites and such. And that's kind of an interesting idea. This shows major Russian storage sites. The reds are national level storage sites, blue are naval storage, and then green are major Russian Air Force storage sites. And there's a lot of interest, for example, in this site here near Pskov, up near the Baltic states, in just moving those weapons away from the NATO-Russia border. I think this is actually as much political as anything else. In fact, you would have to be careful if you had a measure that said move weapons back from the NATO-Russia border. One, you would not want to take it from a facility where they're stored in a storage area that is not co-located with an Air Force base, move it back 500 kilometers and a storage area where it is co-located for the Air Force base, because while it would be politically useful, you would actually perhaps make the weapons more useful, or more usable. The second thing to bear in mind, and I think this was an experience we went through with the negotiations on intermediate-range nuclear forces in the 1980s, is that if the Russians were to do anything in terms of bringing weapons back from the NATO-Russia border, they need to stay on this side of the Ural Mountains. If they go east of the Ural Mountains, there will be a lot of concern on the part of China, Japan, and other countries in Asia. Now, the problem where I think confidence-building measures, and there's, I think, particularly in the Baltic states and Central Europe, interest in this idea of pushing them back, is when you look at measures for pulling back from borders or for consolidation of a smaller number of sites, they don't work so well when you apply on them on the American side. And this is from the Federation of American Scientists, but basically what they say is you have now 6 American active nuclear weapons storage sites in Europe, 1 in Germany, 1 in Belgium, 1 in Italy, 1 in the Netherlands, 1 in Turkey, 2 in Italy. So a total of 6. And the problem that you have is you talk about consolidating and reducing those numbers. Unless you're talking about Italy, any consolidation means closing down a nuclear weapons site in one of those NATO allies. And right now, I think the 5 countries that we believe host American nuclear weapons, there's a certain amount of comfort in that there are 4 other countries hosting them. If you start to go down to 4 or 3, that I think there is concern within Europe that generates pressure on those remaining countries that are hosting American nuclear weapons to follow suit. So it's not clear that confidence-building measures, as attractive as they might be to apply on the Russian side, can also be applied in a reciprocal way on the U.S. side. In any case, if you do go down that route, I think it's going to require a fairly major political decision with a lot of care to Allied sensitivities. So those are 2 options: a big approach, a limit approach on nuclear reductions. I think the next question is missile defense, which I'll talk about for a moment, because I believe that you're not going to get into any reductions with the Russians until you can find a way to resolve the issue of missile defense, which has been a problem between both Washington and Moscow, but also between NATO and Russia now for about 2.5 years. And where NATO would like to go, and there's actually an agreement in principle between NATO and Russia to explore this, is a cooperative missile defense system for Europe, which I think would have 2 advantages. One, it would defuse missile defense as a problem between NATO and Russia, and perhaps remove an obstacle to further reductions. But second, a cooperative missile defense actually has some interest. For example, U.S. government officials would like to get access to Russian radar data from their radar at Arm Revere in southern Russia, because that happens to have a very good look at Iran, and probably would be the first ground-based radar to pick up a ballistic missile launch coming out of Iran. So a cooperative system that actually gave you access to that would actually be a better defense from the NATO perspective. The NATO discussion with Russia has focused for the last few years on the European phased adaptive approach, which has 4 phases. And the idea was that the United States would deploy around or in Europe increasingly more capable SM-3 missile interceptors in anticipation that Iran would develop increasingly long-range ballistic missiles. So right now it's phase 1. There are U.S. Navy ships in the area that can contribute their SM-3 1A interceptors to NATO defense, and they have some capability against short-range and medium-range Iranian missiles. And then the idea is phase 2 will be in 2015 with the deployment of a better missile in Romania, phase 3 in Poland with yet a better missile that can deal with intermediate range Iranian missiles. And the news from about 10 days ago was phase 4 has been canceled. Phase 4 was intended to give the capability to deploy, presumably in Poland, the SM-3 Block 2B. And the idea was that that missile would have the range and the velocity to engage an Iranian intercontinental ballistic missile headed for the United States. And the missile was running into lots of problems. There were really questions. A, could they get the interceptor, which is still on the drawing board, to achieve the necessary velocity? But second, also, could they get it if they wanted to put it on board a Navy ship to fit in the 21-inch diameter vertical launch box that is now the standard for U.S. Navy ships and submarines? And there were serious doubts as to whether that was possible. Phase 4 is the system that the Russians have expressed the most heartburn about over the last 2 years. And the Russian argument basically boils down to, in Moscow, we do not see the possibility that Iran is going to get an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States in the next years or even decades. Therefore, this system must be aimed at us. Well, the interesting thing was that phase 4 has now been canceled, and that perhaps creates an opening. The original Russian reaction early last week was not very encouraging, but by the end of the week they were making more nuanced sounds suggesting that in fact they were leaving the possibility open. Now, if they can get past that, in fact, there's actually quite a bit of convergence that came out of talks in early 2011 between the Pentagon and the Russian Ministry of Defense on what a cooperative NATO-Russia missile defense arrangement would look like. First of all, they agreed you have to have transparency regarding each other's capabilities. There have to be joint exercises, and there's already a history now of about 10, 11 years of both NATO-Russia and U.S.-Russia joint exercises. But they also talked about there would be 2 independent systems, not a single system. And that's what NATO was not prepared to work for Russia, Russia was not prepared to work for NATO. And each side wants to keep control of its sensors and radars and satellites. And each side also wants to keep independent control of a decision to launch either a NATO or a Russian missile interceptor. So they would be 2 independent systems. They would interface, though, in a couple of ways. One would be a data fusion center, where you would take early warning and tracking data from American and NATO radars and other sensors, and you take the same material from the Russian side, bring it to a center jointly manned by NATO and Russian military officers, combine that data, and then send the enhanced products back to the NATO and Russian missile defense commands. And that would presumably be the way that the United States would gain access to Russian data at Armavir, in return, of course, for providing some data from the American side. The second jointly manned center would be a planning and operations center. And the idea there is that's where NATO and Russia would, on a continuing basis, discuss things like, what is the threat that you're worried about? For NATO, it focuses on Iran at the moment. What are the attack scenarios that your missile defense capabilities are preparing to deal with? And then perhaps even going so far as a discussion of things like what would be rules of engagement. Because you would, I think, want to have some idea of how the other side is going to operate in a missile defense environment. In a Track 2 conversation a couple of years ago, actually one retired Russian general suggested that you might even have NATO and Russia develop a common computer protocol to guide their independent decisions to launch an interceptor. And his point was, and I think he's right on this, is basically a computer will report a launch. After burnout of the missile, it will then plot the trajectory, the target, and will give you an intercept solution. And the purpose of the human in the loop is going to be say yes or no. That person's probably not going to have much time to consult. Certainly there will not be time for a NATO-Russia consultation. But if the sides are working off of the same computer protocol, the sides can in fact have systems that have been synced in advance and avoid what he described as the worst case analysis, or the worst case scenario would be an Iranian ballistic missile headed for somewhere on the Polish-Belarusian border, and you have a NATO decision and a Russian decision to launch interceptors, and the interceptors engage one another and give the Iranian warhead a free ride. So there are some thoughts. I think that kind of common protocol is probably not a first step, but there are some interesting ideas out there about how you could make these systems work. Now, the thing that has to happen, or I think the big thing to watch from Moscow is, for the last 2 years, they have insisted that before they would engage in a cooperative missile defense arrangement, there must be what they call a legal guarantee that American missile defenses not be directed at Russian strategic forces. And even were the Obama administration inclined to give that kind of legal guarantee, I think it's a safe bet that there's no way that the Senate would ever ratify it. And the Russians understand this. So the question is, will the Russians back off of that? I think the Obama administration has already said it's prepared to give a political commitment. And in fact, NATO made a political commitment at its summit in May regarding this. So if the Russians do back off of that legal guarantee, it may open up the way. I think a bit more transparency on the American side regarding American missile defense capabilities might help to grease the wheels with the Russians on this. So just briefly on multilateral process, because the U.S. and Russia cannot forever be the only countries talking about nuclear limits and nuclear reductions. There is now a process underway, the UN Security Council, P5 talks, that are talking about their obligations as official nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to move towards disarmament. This process is beginning with baby steps, but there's an interesting step going on now, which is that the Chinese are chairing a working group, the purpose of which is to talk about common terms. I think when the United States and Russian officials sit down and talk, given 40 years of dialogue going back to the 1960s, there's a lot of common understanding. But the idea is to come up with terminology so that when we say strategic stability, all five of the P5 understand in the same way what we're talking about. But hopefully that could begin to move into a further process. Again, if looking with baby steps, could you, for example, get other nuclear weapon states to give a little bit of transparency with regards to their nuclear weapons levels? I think in the case of China, the Chinese certainly do not want to reveal locations at this point, because I think they use the ability to hide and mobility as a way to protect a small force against what they fear might be a large American attack. But could we at least begin with a number in terms of overall weapons numbers? And then ultimately, could you move towards a system or an agreement where other countries would not necessarily engage in a negotiation, but they would make a unilateral political commitment not to build up, so that you avoid a situation where if you can get the Russians to come down, that you don't have other countries building up, which would complicate the process. So those are some of the opportunities looking out of the next several years, which I think are possible. They're going to take a lot of attention, they're going to take a lot of hard work, a lot of presidential leadership, and also some luck. But let me just talk for a moment about what are the challenges. I'll give you 3 or 4 big challenges to this. And I think the first and most important challenge is, are the Russians ready to play? If you look at the last 2 years, you've not seen much enthusiasm coming out of Moscow for further nuclear reductions. Part of this, I think, was they did not want to go too far down with the Obama administration until they knew who was going to be president in 2013. And in fact, in Moscow in the spring of 2011, I had a senior Russian official tell me they were not going to do anything because they did not want to get engaged with the Obama administration and then discover that there was a Republican who might go in a very different direction in arms control and missile defense. So we'll have to, I think this is a big question. Are they prepared to deal? I have to say I'm not quite as optimistic as I was 8 or 9 months ago because in the last 3 months, when the Russians have known who will be in the White House for the next 4 years, it's hard to discern any signs of give or new thinking on their part. But I do think that the Russians may have a couple of incentives to engage. First, this is the data exchange that took place in September of 2012, or this is what was publicized. Actually, the data exchange runs about 100, 150 pages each, because not only do you give the total numbers, but you also declare the locations of every deployed strategic delivery vehicle and such. But that is not normally released. But these are the numbers here as of September 2012. I suspect within a month or so we'll have the February 2013 numbers. The interesting thing to hear is that Russia is already well below the limit on deployed strategic delivery vehicles, and also below the limit on deployed strategic warheads. Now, some American analysts at the Federation of American Scientists think that the Russians are probably headed to about 1,300, given the anticipated rate at which they're going to be retiring old missiles which are already past their shelf date. Alexei Arbatov, who's a fairly good analyst in Russia, says that in fact Moscow could go down as low as 1,100 warheads in the next several years. Now, what that means is, in order to get back up to 1550, the Russians are going to have to make some significant investments. The U.S. military, with the force structure it has now and will have for the next 15 years, will have absolutely no problem staying at 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles and 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. So an option for the Russians is, instead of spending more money than they might have to build new systems, to build back up to 1550 to maintain parity, would be a negotiation to bring the United States down. The second incentive I think the Russians have is this row here, reserve strategic warheads. And had I been a member of the Russian Duma, and had the Duma not been a rubber stamp body, this would have been the biggest challenge I would have had on the Russian side to the New START treaty. And that is, the United States has more reserve strategic warheads, but the United States has a much greater potential to take reserve warheads and actually deploy them. And that is because as the Russians draw down their missiles, it appears they are retiring missiles. And the missiles that they retain in the force are carrying full warhead sets. On the U.S. side, I think virtually all American ICBMs and SLBMs will be downloaded. So the Trident submarine-launched ballistic missile can carry 8 warheads. Under New START, the average Trident missile will carry 4 to 5. Now those extra warheads are going to go sit somewhere in a storage area. And even if we wanted to dismantle them, they're probably at the back of the queue, so they've got a 7 or 8 year wait. But if there were a geopolitical surprise, if the treaty were to break down, the United States could put those weapons, pull them out of storage, obviously after pulling out of the treaty, and put them back on and deploy them. And I think, by my count, the United States could probably add about 1,000 deployed strategic warheads. It has that many spaces on its ICBMs and its SLBMs. And the Russians, at least for the foreseeable future, cannot match that. And I've had some conversations with Russians. I think this does bother some Russians, that this imbalance gives them some concern. So those are a couple of incentives, and I think the general one is just the overall political question. The Russians in the past, I think, have seen value from having a negotiation going on with the United States on nuclear weapons, because that's a validation that they are a superpower. At least that is the one area in which they are a superpower. So we'll have to see how this plays out. A second concern I would mention in terms of challenges is allies' reaction. If we were to get the kind of big treaty that I talked about, going down to, say, 2,000 weapons, first of all, that's going to be really, really hard to get the Russians there. But if you do get the Russians there, you can count on a Russian insistence that there be a requirement in the treaty that all nuclear weapons be based on national territory. And that will require the removal of American weapons from Europe. Now, for me, that's not such a huge jump, because I think in 8 or 9 years, most of those weapons are coming out anyway. But it will raise the question of assurance to allies. It's interesting, when one talks to U.S. officials in Washington now, you don't hear anybody say, we need American nuclear weapons in Europe to deter an outside attack. But what you do hear is, we need those weapons to assure those allies, primarily in Central Europe and the Baltic states, who still, because of historical reasons, because of proximity to Russia, still see those weapons as important symbols of U.S. commitment. So if we do get this kind of big treaty, and we're faced with that, we're going to have to find some way to persuade allies that this does not mean an end to the American security commitment. Now, certainly if you get this treaty, and if you get a cooperative missile defense arrangement, that will change the overall political atmospherics, will help. But it may be important for the United States to think about some non-nuclear ways to enhance assurance to allies who feel a bit more exposed. A third challenge is going to be verification. And that is because you're going to go beyond the New START treaty, which the intelligence community believes can be monitored with fairly high confidence. But that's because when you're looking at the ICBMs and SLBM warheads, you know where the ICBMs are. They're in deployed silos. We know those locations. Or they're in submarines, and you go and you visit those submarines, and you see those submarines in port when your inspection team goes. If you start talking about limiting non-deployed or reserve strategic weapons, or if you start talking about limits on non-strategic nuclear weapons that are not on their delivery systems, you're talking about going into storage bunkers and things like this. This is the only picture I could find purportedly of a nuclear weapon storage site. There's so many there, I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but this is supposedly a B-61 storage site. So you're going to have to reach the point, presumably, where you would allow inspectors to go into storage areas and actually count reserve weapons or non-deployed strategic weapons. Now, that's not an impossible task, but it's going to push the sides, and it'll push the Russians in particular. My understanding is that during the New START negotiations, at one point, the American side was prepared to say, okay, we will allow inspectors to go and inspect weapons storage facilities at bomber bases to count numbers of weapons. The Russians were not prepared to do that. But if you're going to go into something that limits reserve strategic weapons or non-deployed strategic weapons, the Russians are going to have to get over that hang-up. And it's not just going in and counting these things, but I think that the sides would also want to have some kind of a technology, which I think is there, that would allow you to say, yes, in fact, that is a B-61 bomb. A device that allows you to take a measurement and say, this confirms that there's a mass of highly enriched uranium or plutonium in that bomb consistent with a nuclear weapon, but also designed in a way that it doesn't reveal design details and the sorts of things that you don't want to share and do not need to share in order to show compliance with the treaty. And then I think the fourth challenge for the Obama administration is going to be the U.S. Senate, where I think it's pretty clear Republicans in general tend to be fairly skeptical about arms control. I think that Republicans will be skeptical about if there's another arms control treaty done by the Obama administration. Now, part of this problem, I think, is self-inflicted. There's a feeling, which I think has some basis, is that the Obama administration did not deliver on all the commitments it made during the New START ratification talks, or the ratification debate, and even if you make some allowances for the different budget situation, there is still a view that certain commitments were made that have not been observed, and that may make it harder. And that question, I think, is leading the administration to consider, are there things that you could do other than a treaty? And if they conclude that a treaty has zero chance, and I'm certainly that there are some who worry about that in the administration, are there things that you could do short of a treaty? And one possibility might be political commitments. There are actually quite a few precedents that you could take over the last 40, 45 years. But one would be, for example, a political commitment, where say you did just the quick treaty on New START, and you wanted to go from 1550 down to 1,000. If the Russians would agree, President Obama and President Putin could each say, as a matter of national policy, I'm going to reduce my strategic forces to no more than 1,000 deployed strategic warheads. Now, that would be a statement of national policy. It would only be politically binding, but the sides could use the New START treaty and its monitoring mechanisms, in fact, to verify not only the 1550 legal limit, but also the 1,000 political limit. So let me just close by saying I think there's some opportunities out there. There's some pretty daunting challenges, but it's worth trying to see what comes of this. In terms of how far you get, I think there's 2 or 3 things to look forward to. National Security Advisor Tom Donilon is still reportedly preparing to go to Moscow sometime in April. That's slipped by a couple of months. But that would be one time to engage with the Russians, not only on the broader U.S.-Russia relationship, but also on next steps on nuclear arms control. A second thing to watch is we have a couple of anniversaries coming up, the anniversary of the signing of the New START Treaty, but also the anniversary of President Obama's Prague speech. Is there a senior administration official speaking around that time in which they could give some sense as to where the administration wants to go? And then finally, President Obama and President Putin have 2 meetings sort of penciled on the calendar. They'll meet in Northern Ireland in June on the margins of the G8, and they're supposed to then meet again in September on the margins of the G20 in September. So there are a couple of opportunities for the 2 principals to talk about where they want to go. And again, I think there's interest on the part of the Obama administration in doing something more on nuclear reductions, and what they're going to be doing is probing the Russians to see what kind of interest there may be in Moscow. And at that point, why don't I stop and be happy to take questions?
Terrific. It was